Welcome to the Mondoweiss Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Reed. At Mondoweiss, we cover the movements, activists, and policymakers who affect the struggle for freedom in Palestine. Last Friday, as the holy month of Ramadan came to a close, Israeli forces stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem's Old City. Mondoweiss's Palestine correspondent Yumna Patel reported that, quote, the height of the violence took place inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, where tens of thousands of Palestinian worshippers had gathered inside the mosque and the surrounding courtyard for evening prayers on the last Friday of Ramadan. Video footage from the scene shows people in prayer when armed Israeli forces stormed the compound, firing sound bombs, tear gas, and rubber bullets at worshippers. By Monday, events had escalated. Hamas issued an ultimatum to Israel: withdraw from Al-Aqsa in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood by 6 p.m. and release all the Palestinians detained by police during the recent tensions in Jerusalem, or there would be retaliation. Shortly after 6 p.m., Hamas launched several barrages of rockets from Gaza, targeting Jerusalem and other cities farther inside Israeli territory than in past rounds of violence. The Israeli reaction has been brutal. Airstrikes and land-based attacks on Gaza are still ongoing as we record this episode. Well over 100 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed by Israeli attacks, many of them children. High-rise apartment and office buildings are being specifically targeted, leaving hundreds of people homeless and destroying the offices of many regional and international media outlets. We spoke with Yumna today for a brief update. After that, Phil Weiss talks to Dr. Norman Finkelstein about the recently released Human Rights Watch report that labels Israel an apartheid regime. This groundbreaking report, as Dr. Finkelstein explains, indicts Israel for its current policies and practices and for the full history of its efforts to engineer Jewish supremacy in Palestine. Yumna, can you give us an update on what you've been seeing over the last 24 hours?
So the situation is developing super rapidly across Palestine. Currently, in the occupied West Bank, protests have spread in almost every district from the southern West Bank to the northern West Bank. These protests are ongoing as we speak. A short while ago, I was covering one of the protests in the city of Bethlehem. Something distinctive that's happening right now is Israeli forces are extensively using live fire in these protests. At least 6 Palestinian protesters have been killed just in the past couple of hours in protests across the West Bank. There are dozens of injuries. The Palestinian Ministry of Health is reporting currently 91 injuries, but those are only ones that are being treated in health centers across the territory. And they're saying that most of the injuries they're seeing are the result of live ammunition. So things are definitely escalating. The protests don't seem like they're going to be stopping. Things are continuing to develop in the West Bank now, where we're seeing these protests. And in Gaza, Israel is continuing to bombard Gaza with airstrikes, and demonstrations and protests are continuing across Palestinian communities inside East Jerusalem and inside Israel as well.
We're starting to see reports and video and photos of Palestinians and Jordanians actually crossing the border into the West Bank. What do you know about that? Have you been able to confirm it?
I haven't been able to independently confirm that protesters from Jordan have managed to break through the border with the West Bank, but I've seen several reports from local Palestinian Arabic language media saying that some of the protesters from Jordan have managed to cut through portions of the fence along the border with the West Bank, close to the Jordan Valley and also close to Jericho. There are reports and going around in Palestinian media saying that some of the groups have managed to get in, and they're currently marching on their way through these rural areas and mountains in Jericho and the Jordan Valley, and are on their way to the Palestinian cities and areas in the West Bank. There were some videos that I saw of West Bank Palestinians from the West Bank and also Palestinians from Jerusalem who came and have sort of parked their cars and are waiting in Jericho and waiting in cities and towns in the Jordan Valley, essentially waiting to pick up these protesters wherever they end up coming out, if they do end up coming out, if they're even, inside the West Bank. So the situation is developing. I haven't been able to confirm it, but we're seeing a lot of these reports and videos on social media and then also in Palestinian media. But if this is true, this has never happened before. This is a historic moment. It's also important to keep in mind that Jordan has a significant Palestinian population. There are millions of Palestinian refugees and then descendants of Palestinian refugees and Palestinians who have been exiled who are living in Jordan. And so, a lot of Palestinians have been posting on social media. In just, in the past few minutes, I've been seeing a lot of posts where people are just in awe of what is happening and are just totally dumbfounded by the fact that, people in Jordan, Palestinians in Jordan took to the border and potentially made it through. It's definitely a symbol. Palestinians are treating it as a symbol, of the right of return that Palestinians have been denied, that Palestinian refugees have been denied for decades. So we're witnessing something truly historic. If it is the case that people did manage to enter into the West Bank.
There are protests and confrontations with Israeli forces happening in the West Bank, Jerusalem, and in some cities inside Israeli territory. Is there any organization to them yet, or are they spontaneously developing out of these local communities?
So the thing that Palestinians are pointing out about what the current moment that we're in and sort of the defining character that is distinguishing this moment and these uprisings and these protests that we're seeing from, similar situations in the past is that this is very much a grassroots-led movement that started in the streets. It's being led by Palestinian youth. It's being led by civil society. It's being led just by ordinary people in the streets, going out, protesting, standing up, and voicing their opposition to, Israeli apartheid and the regime that has oppressed them and suffocated them for decades. And the thing that is different this time around that, Palestinians have expressed to me and that Palestinians are expressing all across social media is that this is a movement being led by the youth. The Palestinian leadership or so-called leadership has no role in this. Whereas in the past, different Palestinian political factions and Palestinian leaders and leaders within the Palestinian Authority would call for, collective, for example, days of rage or protest against the U.S. decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. But this time it's very much being led by the streets. It's happening in the streets. It's a grassroots movement, and Palestinian youth are actively fighting against any efforts of the Palestinian leadership to attempt to sort of co-opt this movement.
What is the Palestinian Authority leadership doing right now?
I guess short answer, nothing. I mean, aside from, sort of empty statements and words of support, from Abbas saying that he supports the Palestinian people and stands with the Palestinian people and et cetera, XYZ, in terms of actual sort of movement and, stuff on the ground. I think that the PA has been sidelined, and they've also, they've been sidelined and they've also sort of haven't taken any concrete action in regards to the current movement. There's been a lot of jokes about, just sort of Abbas sort of hiding out in his compound and sort of not really showing his face because he doesn't have anything to say, for the Palestinian people. Something that's really important to note in a lot of these protests, a large feature of the protests, not just in the West Bank, in cities like Haifa as well, that are inside Israel, Palestinian youth have been vocalizing their frustration with the Palestinian Authority and with Mahmoud Abbas and his regime So these protests aren't just directed at, the Israeli apartheid regime and the Israeli occupation. These are also directed at the so-called Palestinian leaders as well. In one of the protests this morning in Bethlehem, there were hundreds of youth marching through the streets, calling Abbas a coward and a collaborator and a traitor, saying that they're going to, quote unquote, step on his head, and just throwing insults at the Palestinian Authority, saying that, their government are a bunch of traitors. So that's the feeling amongst Palestinian youth. And I think it's one that's being felt all across the board towards their leaders.
Yumna, thanks so much for the update. Please stay safe.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hi, Norman. Hey, thanks very much for joining us today. I appreciate your putting a nice shirt on a Sunday morning for us.
Well, it was an effort.
Okay. So, Norman, one of your great skills is that you know how to read human rights reports. You know how to read texts. You know how to read the histories of Israel and Palestine. And I know that this week you did something I don't imagine anyone else has done. You read the Human Rights Watch report accusing Israel of the crimes of apartheid and persecution. You read that a couple of times over closely and emerged with some insights and conclusions. And the reason we wanted to have you on is just to have you share your impressions and insights from that reading. And I sort of want you to take the floor and tell me what's significant. I'm going to jump in now and then just to perform the master of ceremonies task. But I was hoping that you could explain what is important about this report.
Well, there are actually many aspects of it that are important. Let me just begin with the immediate context. The immediate context is, I think, the International Criminal Court prosecution or investigation of Israeli war crimes, which had been long in the making. I think Israel was first brought before the court in about 2009, if my memory is right. And there have been a huge number of proceedings at the court over trying to indict Israel for its crimes against Palestinians. Those proceedings were protracted and went nowhere until this past year. There's no point here in going through all the details, but this past year, the ICC announced that it was going to proceed with an investigation of Israeli crimes. I myself was skeptical that it was going to go very far because, as you know, in law, there are always these technicalities and cases can be thrown out. And I thought for certain uncertain technicalities, the case would be thrown out by the court. But then, lo and behold, approximately 2 months ago, something happened which I didn't expect at all, which is B'Tselem, Israel's leading human rights organization on Israeli human rights violations and crimes in the occupied Palestinian territories, issued a position paper. And the position paper, actually, I have it right here because I'm reading it for some other things I'm writing. The position paper, the title, I'll just read you the title. It's one sentence. A regime of Jewish supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, : this is apartheid. Now, there were three aspects of that title, just the title, which stood out. Number one, the use of the term Jewish supremacy. Obviously, that resonates a lot in the current political ambiance because it sounds so much like white supremacy. And now they were invoking, B'Tselem was invoking the term Jewish supremacy. Number two, the report did not limit itself to the occupied Palestinian territories. It now spoke to the whole area, including Israel pre-June 67, the whole area. They were characterizing the whole area as if to say there is no longer an occupation. There is now, in effect, an annexation. There is one state. So the template to which we had grown accustomed since 1967, Israel here, occupied Palestinian territories there, they now were recasting it. It was one state. And of course, the third thing is they invoked the bogey word. This is apartheid. So that was, actually, I would have to say it was a shock to me. Clearly, a Rubicon had been crossed here. They were reinventing the Israel-Palestine conflict. And now, I should say, that report did not get much coverage. I don't think it was reported in the New York Times or the Washington Post.
Not the Times.
Right. It was ignored. Nonetheless, for those in the know, it resonated. And now comes the third step, or the third part of the triptych, namely the HRW report. And the HRW report is actually astonishing in several regards. Number one, I should just say as a general principle, it fits in the pattern. ICC, B'Tselem, now Human Rights Watch. And I was told yesterday that Al-Haq, the main Palestinian human rights organization, and Amnesty will shortly be coming out with reports reaching the same conclusion. Israel is practicing apartheid. So, but HRW is the most respected, most prominent, and for our purposes, the most important thing, it's the most mainstream of the human rights organizations. So the largest, most prominent, and most mainstream of the human rights organizations puts out this report. It's titled A Threshold Crossed. I'll get to the title in a moment, just for the sake of your listeners, to describe it a bit. It's over 200 pages, and it's exhaustively researched. When I say exhaustively, coming from me, that's a high compliment. I was astonished at the range of sources they cited, the depth of the sources. It's as if every single government regulation, every single court case, every single human rights report that's ever been published on the subject is included in the report. Now, what makes the report unusual? I've had differences of opinion with some people on this, because it is true that Human Rights Watch limits its most extreme condemnation to the occupied Palestinian territories. It says that in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, Israel is practicing apartheid. So it doesn't indict the whole Israeli system as based on apartheid, which is what B'Tselem does. it does limit its most extreme condemnation to the occupied Palestinian territories. However, it goes much further in its condemnation than B'Tselem for the following reason. B'Tselem limits itself to the present. What's happening now, what's been happening, say, the last couple of decades. And so they focus on three issues: political rights, freedom of movement, and land confiscation. Those are the three aspects of Israeli apartheid that they home in on. Human Rights Watch does something entirely different. And it's something that your listeners, your viewers should attend to. Namely, it goes back to the beginning. It says these policies, I'll use their terms, these policies of domination, they don't use the expression Jewish supremacy. They say the Israeli regime from the Jordan to the Mediterranean, the whole area, the Israeli regime is based on a system of, and I'm using their term, throughout the 214 pages. It's not like just thrown in at some point. It's there on every page. The regime that Israel created in 1948 to the present is one based on Jewish domination. Now, I think you'll agree, because your forte is the English language. It's barely a fleece hop from Jewish supremacy to Jewish domination. They both don't ring well.
No.
With an American ear.
That's for sure.
And they say it's a regime of Jewish domination across the board from the Mediterranean to the Jordan. So, unlike all the other reports, and even unlike the ICC, because the ICC is limited to what's called the State of Palestine, namely the West Bank, Gaza, including East Jerusalem, that's HRW does something entirely different. At the risk of sounding hyperbolic, they indict the Israeli project. Some people call it, I prefer not to use the catchwords, some people call it the Zionist enterprise or the Zionist project. I'll just call it, they indict the Israeli project from day one, not June 6th or 5th, 1967. They indicted from the state of Israel's, actually they indicted from before the state of Israel's creation, because they indict David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister. They indict him from February 1947 they cite statements of him implying that he wanted to ethnically cleanse the newly created state of Israel and create a Jewish majority. So, for the sake of your viewers, I'll be more precise, your listeners. The indictment doesn't even begin with Israel's creation. It begins with the war, what's called by Israel, the War of Independence, and the undertakings of the Zionist leadership at the time, the Yishuv leadership, the undertakings to ethnically cleanse Palestine. Now, this indictment includes, if you read the report carefully, I'm now rereading it for the third time because I'm taking my notes. This report indicts every aspect of what's normally considered the earmarks of a Jewish state. What do I mean by that? When Israel speaks about a Jewish state, obviously the first thing it speaks of is a Jewish majority. For Israelis, the notion, and actually for non-Israelis as well, the notion of a Jewish state is synonymous with the notion of a Jewish majority.
And sometimes a strong Jewish majority.
A strong Jewish. Well, actually, they go through all the numbers. The report is exhaustive. They will quote one Israeli leader as saying the Arabs can't be more than 20%.
Wow.
Another Israeli leader is saying the Arabs can't be more than 35%. They go through all the percentages that each Israeli leader is demanding or requiring. And they say, now here, it's what you might call a gray area, but it's not as gray as you would expect. They say, and I think technically they're correct, they're more knowledgeable in the law on this particular matter than I am. They say, under international law, there is no stipulation, or I should say, there's no prohibition on a state determining its demographic balance or makeup. A state has the right to, for example, regulate immigration in order to encourage one ethnic immigration as against another. However, and here is the critical caveat, which I'm sure you'll immediately appreciate, it says a state has no right to regulate immigration at the expense of the fundamental rights of an indigenous people. What does that mean? Israel has no right to privilege Jewish immigration over the 5.7 million Palestinian refugees. It has no right to privilege, as they put it, a Jew anywhere in the world who's never set foot on Israeli soil, that he or she should have the privilege under the law of return and the citizenship law, should have the privilege of going there over the right of a Palestinian who was expelled to return to his or her homeland. So, the Human Rights Watch report not only repeatedly calls for Israel to, under international law, implement the right of return. It goes even one step further. It delegitimizes the whole idea of a Jewish majority, because latent in the idea of a Jewish majority is the idea, according to Human Rights Watch, of Jewish domination. I would say here it's a little bit of a gray area, but if you read the report, you can't help but walk away with the feeling that they have now undermined the central pillar of the idea of a Jewish state, namely the idea of trying to, and here I'm using HRW's words, the idea of trying to, again, I want to make sure I'm quoting them, engineering a Jewish majority. They seem to be saying that trying to engineer a Jewish majority, whether it be in the whole of the land from the Mediterranean to the Jordan, or whether it be just in East Jerusalem, the idea, or whether it be in the Negev, or whether it be in the Galilee, or whether it be in Nazareth. They go through each of those permutations and combinations. They look at the whole area, they look at the occupied territories, they look at isolated areas, the Negev, or I should say local areas, the Negev, the Galilee, Nazareth. They say all of these Israeli projects designed to engineer a Jewish majority, all of those projects are in breach of international law because they're based on the principle of Jewish domination. So you can imagine, I was quite surprised to see a mainstream human rights organization based in the United States with strong connections with the Democratic Party. I was surprised that they were now casting doubt, and that may be a euphemism, they were now casting doubt on the whole legitimacy of the idea of a Jewish state. The second area which they go at with a vengeance is the massive Israeli Jewish confiscations of Palestinian land, beginning with the refugees from 1948, then going after the war, going after the lands of the Palestinians who stayed within Israel, taking their lands, then the lands of the Palestinians in the West Bank, then, and simultaneously, obviously, the lands of the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. And the image that's summoned up by the report, it's just this vast, sinister, almost sadistic juggernaut, this Israeli juggernaut of robbing the Palestinians of their lands, relentlessly robbing them of their land. And, you know, I come from a family, Phil, you know what it's like in New York. In New York City, if you want to build a fence along your property, you have to hire a surveyor. Why? To make sure that you don't even infringe an inch. Now, I'm not exaggerating here because I know, I remember growing up, an inch on your neighbor's property.
Yes.
And if your fence is 1 inch off, the neighbor has the right to knock it down.
Right.
And so I'm kind of sensitive, having grown up in that sort of neighborhood, sensitive to land confiscations. And so when you read the report, it just sickens you. It nauseates you. This heartless, relentless juggernaut, this maw swallowing up the Palestinian land. It's a very ugly picture that they paint in the report.
So, Norman, I thank you for that summary. I want to jump in to ask a sort of political question about this. Everything you've told me, while it's a surprise to learn that it's from the mouth of HRW and in the terms that you describe, these emphatic terms and these new formulations that have a great deal of power, the actual practices and conditions are ones that are familiar to people from reading your work, and certainly from reading the discourse of the left on ethnic cleansing and Palestinian the Palestinian experience of the last 75 years. You began, so in that sense, there's no shock. You began by framing this in political terms. And what I took from that, your exposition of the fact that ICC, one shoe dropped, the International Criminal Court, another shoe dropped, B'Tselem, and now this third shoe drops. What I took from what you're saying is that in the past, there was something self-marginalizing about using the word apartheid. If you said apartheid, the bogey word, to quote you, you were making a willful, you were in a sense excommunicating yourself from the discourse, as Jimmy Carter found in 2006. And it strikes me from what you were saying at the start that you discern a concerted effort to demarginalize, to remove that red line on the apartheid word, and in fact to shift the paradigm. And when I say concerted, you're talking about these sort of three sort of blows from mainstream organizations. Tell me if I'm reading you right. I'm trying to shift you now to the sort of politics of this, because everything you've said substantively might have been quoted from your own work or from the left-wing discourse 10 years ago, if you follow what I'm saying.
Well, actually, of course, I follow what you're saying, and there's a lot to say in response. So let me try to go through in bullet points, and then you'll ask me to elaborate on whichever point interests you. Number one, Israel has, in the last few years, one of its foci, of its supporters, has been to try to delegitimize on college campuses what's called Israel Apartheid Week. And they thought that they had this in the bag with trying to impose also on colleges the IHRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism, which seemed to demonize any comparisons between Israel and apartheid South Africa. That was a taboo. Well, guess what happened? The main human rights organizations have now legitimized Israel Apartheid Week. And that's a huge blow to the propaganda machine.
I agree with you.
Israel's PR machine. It's a huge blow. They can no longer go and claim that these calls for ending Israeli apartheid are historically inaccurate and offensive to Jews. That's over. Number two, the HRW, quite surprising to me. Remember, we're talking about Ken Roth. HRW said...
He's the head of Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth.
The executive director of Human Rights Watch. It said that the prosecutor of the ICC, among its bill of indictment against Israel, now you'll be shocked to hear this, they said the bill of indictment should be expanded to indict Israel for crimes against humanity, including the crime of persecution and apartheid. Now, Phil, to appreciate what they're saying, no court to date has indicted any state for the crime of apartheid. No court. So now HRW was calling on the ICC to break precedent and for the first time indict a state for crimes against humanity, including the crime of apartheid. Now, you're going to laugh at this. You know why? One of the examples of anti-Semitism in the IHRA definition, International Holocaust Remembrance Association of definition of anti-Semitism is it says it opposes double standards. You can't hold Israel to a different standard. Well, guess what? HRW just said, oh, yes, you can. No state has ever been indicted for the crime of apartheid, but we think in its recommendations, it says, it's our view that the ICC chief prosecutor should include the crime of apartheid in its indictment of Israel. That was pretty breathtaking. I was totally stunned. And now the third thing, up until now, and this is probably the most important political point, up until now, since 1967, and then specifically since the early 1970s, the paradigm of the international community, as you know, congealed around the two-state settlement. And basically, the two-state settlement said Israel remains as it is, but within the June 67 border. It acknowledged a Palestinian refugee issue from 1948, but the consensus was that the resolution of the refugee question would fall very, very, very far short of the repatriation of the 5.7 million Palestinian refugees. That was the consensus. Now, what did HRW do? It was actually, again, I know I'm repeating the word to the point that it's losing its force, but I was bewildered. They have a recommendation, what they call recommendations, and they have one recommendation to the Palestine Liberation Organization. And do you know what the recommendation said? The recommendation said you should drop all the talk about the political solution at the end, namely two states, and you should simply focus on the full human rights of Palestinians everywhere, not just occupied territories, the full human rights of Palestinians in Israel. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist or somebody attuned to semiotic analysis to read that as saying, just go for a civil rights struggle, one person, one vote. And so they have effectively jettisoned the two-state model and said, don't focus on one state, two states, three states, whatever. Just focus on realizing your full human rights as Palestinians. And as I read it, I want to just, you'll excuse me, I want to be absolutely sure because I want to be responsible to your listeners. Just give me 1/2 second. I have it right here. It says recommendations. And now let me read it to your audience. So it's the way to leave off. Adopt, this is to the PLO, adopt an advocacy strategy centered on the immediate attainment of the full human rights of Palestinians rather than one that puts off attainment of human rights in favor of a particular political outcome.
That's pretty direct.
Yes, well, you know, you're the English maven, not me. I think that's pretty direct. It says forget about the two states, just advocate for an advocacy strategy that focuses on the full human rights of all Palestinians. It doesn't say Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories. the full human rights of all Palestinians. Now, Phil, if you read it literally, it's a breathtaking statement. Why? Because the full human rights of all Palestinians includes the 5.7 million refugees.
Yes, of course.
And that means their right of return.
Yes.
So I don't know yet what this will translate into politically on the ground, but at the level of at the symbolic level and the judicial level, it's something really new.
Wow.
It means that, look, Human Rights Watch has a liberal, progressive donor base and following. Among other things, it means that the consensus in the U.S. has significantly shifted. From the song When I Was Growing Up, something is happening here. They did not fear losing their donor base and their constituency by putting forth a report like this. And if you were to ask me the nearest analogy to it, I would say this, and we can leave off on this note. Up until the 1970s, Professor Chomsky was very critical of the two-state settlement, and he was a binationalist. By the early 1970s, he said binationalism was no longer politically tenable because the international community had the consensus of the international community was now crystallized on the lines of two states. And if you read his works from that era, in particular the book Towards a New Cold War, he's starting to make the shift. He's giving up, at least for the present, on binationalism and calls for two states, which up until then he had opposed, called it the ugly solution. And now I think we may be at a moment, the fancy term is an inflection point. I prefer to, use the 1960s. There's something happening here. I think we may be at a moment where there is a kind of paradigm shift happening. Exactly why it's happening now would require another podcast or two.
Yes.
But I think it may be happening now that the whole Israeli system, especially in the era of identity politics, this revulsion and white supremacy now in the public imagination associated with former President Trump and his followers, that those notions have become so toxic and noxious that people have there's now a heightened sensitivity. Well, it's only a flea's hop from white supremacy to Jewish supremacy. And you read the report by HRW, and you just can't help but think on each page, Jesus Christ, what kind of uproar there would be in the U.S. if these sorts of policies were not only implemented, but they were institutionalized and legalized.
Right.
And so I think the milieu in which HRW operates is now so sensitive to these issues of identity and supremacy, domination, and so forth, that I think that's part of the reason why they made this leap. And that then finally is the irony of the title, to which I said I would get back to. It's called A Threshold Crossed. But as you pointed out a moment ago, for most people on the left, this is old news. So no threshold has been crossed except, and here is the great irony of the title, it's Human Rights Watch that crossed the threshold. They crossed a threshold. It's actually, for a veteran like myself, it's a breathtaking sight.
Great. Norman, just one more question, if I could, to follow up on what you said. That's a very helpful exposition, and I share your conclusion. I think you're right. I just want to get clear about one point, and that is that when you talk about there's something that happened here, you don't know what it is, the Dylan song, that was one in which the elites were rocked by sort of the street, by the next generation. And what you're describing here, ultimately, though, is one in which you are saying that the ICC, the HRW, the B'Tselem report, and what you anticipate in Amnesty and Al-Haq, obviously they're not all big establishment organizations, just the same. You are saying that the process we're seeing is one in which the elites, there's something happening here, is that elite opinion is finally shifting. And that is a critical, and that you and I, of course, were there to watch the rebellion that took place when Goldstone dared to say that Israel deliberately was targeting civilians in Gaza. This rebellion is not happening now.
Yeah, I have to stop you there because you're going to laugh at what you just said. Human Rights Watch now writes in the report that during the 3 major assaults on Gaza, cast lead, pillar of defense, protective edge. Now, it says explicitly they targeted civilians.
Wow.
And civilian infrastructure.
Wow.
Never said that before.
Wow.
Never said that before. They kind of sneak it in. They said it twice. They kind of sneak it in because for those who follow these things with an eagle eye, they never dared say that they were targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. They always said disproportionate force.
Yes.
Sometimes they said indiscriminate force, but they never said targeting. Well, now they said targeting.
Wow. So, but just to conclude then, Norman, what you are saying is that the great news here may be that this shift that we were always wondering about, when are the elites, when are the Beltway insiders, or the people who influence the Beltway insiders, when the conventional wisdom in the establishment, when is that going to change? You're saying that moment may be upon us now.
I think among chunks of the establishment.
Okay.
I'm not going to say the establishment as a whole.
I'll take chunks. I'm
not going to say the Elta Cockers. The constituency of Charles Schumer will stay firm. They will stay firm. But I won't say the margins, I won't say the edges, let's just call it the peripheries, which is a little less than the margins. Yes, it's definitely shifting. And for our purposes, the most important thing, in my opinion, is these are new weapons of legitimization or legitimation weapons. If Israel supporters claim that Israel Apartheid Week is anti-Semitic, now all you have to do is hold up in one hand the Human Rights Watch report, in the other hand the B'Tselem report, and saying, are you telling me Israel's largest human rights organization and the most respected human rights organization in the world, are you telling me they're anti-Semitic?
That's good.
They are very powerful weapons. What has now these 2 reports that have been bestowed upon the world, they are very, very powerful. And it's going to give Israel supporters a very hard time.
Norman, that was fantastic. And I really love the last image of you holding up the two tablets as you come down from the mountain there in Brooklyn. No, it was great. I really appreciate your walking us through this. And it's very clarifying. And I look forward to catching up when the next chunk shifts. But have a great Sunday. And I thank you for your patience with our questions.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thanks for listening to our show, a production of Mondoweiss.net. The music is from Sound of Picture. Visit our site to sign up for free daily and weekly newsletters on Palestine, Israel, and related U.S. politics. If you're enjoying our podcast, please consider becoming a donor by visiting Mondoweiss.net/donate. Mondoweiss is a nonprofit publication, and every donation of any amount helps sustain our work. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen, and please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find our show.